So yeah, designing for people with autism. So first of all, I think it would be good to start what is autism. So technically, the term autism, from a scientific perspective, it's described as a lifelong development disability that affects especially how we communicate and how we relate with others. And this can often, for example, be reflected in terms having difficulties in social interactions and communication, that there's often some sort of a restriction or a repetitive pattern of thought behavior, and that it's sometimes just difficult for people with autism to make sense around the world and how things correlate with each other. Um, so from a more specific psychological perspective, what that means is that in research has shown that basically people's brain with autism, they just function in a little bit different way. So what that means is they're just a little bit different wired than the brain of a neurotypical person. So for example, they have higher levels of synaptic connectivity, which means that the neurons and the nerves in the brain are much more frequently communicating to each other and have a much more higher connection than those of non-autistic people, which often responds in like an extreme responsiveness to certain stimuli, and often as a cause is that often experienced much more intensely and frantically than for other people experienced in a way. So as an example, some autistic people, they develop and show exceptional cognitive talents, which are, for example, there are quite a lot of people who are well known, like Albert Einstein, for example, was said to have autism. Amadeus Mozart was said to have autism. Currently, for example, Gretel Thunberg, the Swedish environmentalist. She's a young girl and she has autism. So there are different forms of autism to it. However, the issue with all of this is that it's often in the media is also often presented as something really, really positive or negative, and it can. There's a lot of social studies have shown that there's some sort of an unconscious bias towards people with autism. So if you say like you have autism, there's often like some sort of an unconscious bias that people have because they just really don't fully understand that autism can have a massive spectrum that is really, really much more defined than what you see in the media about people with autism. So, for example, a huge challenge around that is that our society as a whole is completely built around visual, sensory, cognitive, and social needs. And often this can have a massive impact on autistic people, and some less, some for others a little bit stronger. For example, body language, the way we communicate through body language, through facial expressions, metaphorical language, and all that can be really confusing and even alienating for people, and often make them feel excluded. I'm saying right now, I'm just mentioning a couple of things. I will go later into that more specifically, that this can't be applied to everyone. I'm just giving a couple of examples, but because autism has so many different spectrums, and I don't want to put everything in one box, I just mention a couple of things so you guys can imagine a little bit more what I'm talking about. So talking about this, so actually autism is defined as a spectrum condition. What that means is that different people have um, different characteristics of autism or have different experiences. So just because, for example, person one has autism doesn't mean that person two who also has autism, has the exact same um, characteristics or the exact same symptoms or behavioral scheme or patterns. It can be completely different. And there's also like a severity scheme that people differentiate between different types of autism. But that's the main reason actually why it's in our society so difficult for people to understand autism and to understand like the whole spectrum of it, because it can have so many different types and so many different faces. So it's really difficult to understand it. If somebody just tells you what they have autism, there's really like, I think it's a really sensible issue. So we really need to be mindful, because it's not always, one box fits all approach. So for example, some people with autism, for example, they go to universities, they have careers. They're really, really successful in what they're doing. While some other people who have much more severe autism, for example, some people need lifelong support, because also like what is referred to as nonverbal people of autism. That means that people often with severe cases of autism are nonverbal. They don't speak, and these obviously make it difficult for people to communicate in a social interactions basis, and just a lot of people with really, really severe cases definitely need some sort of lifelong support through therapy, through psychologists, through people who care for them. And it's really interesting to see that there are so many different patterns, but it's still so misunderstood. So, for example, Asperger's syndrome, it's a form of autism. So that means if you have autism, you could also have Asperger's syndrome. However, that just because you have autism, that doesn't automatically mean that you have Asperger's syndrome. There are also like of Asperger's syndrome, there are some characteristics that overlap the syndrome that you might have when you have autism. For example, odd speech patterns, which are often treated with speech therapy, so just to help people pronounce things differently or get out of those odd patterns that they're developed. Obsessive compulsions, or sometimes also tics. Limited facial expressions. This refers again to the fact that some people with autism have really difficult time sometimes reading facial expressions, and this results that people with Asperger's syndrome, for example, also it's difficult for them if you understand something, not really something, or you can't read it very well. That also makes it difficult for you to mimic it in a way. And unusual sensitivity to stimuli, which again refers to that people just experience things much more intense often because of their higher connection of in the brain, and their much more information that are processed. The drawing here, I try to illustrate that a little bit, because often what I found online was that people, when there were a lot of research studies that were done with people who had Asperger's and autism and Asperger's syndrome, it was found that a lot of people said they felt isolated in their own head, almost like they were on a little island by themselves, and that the actual physical body is more like of a representation, but they're conscious, but they're continuously in their head by themselves, and just which was quite an interesting explanation that people gave. So what is autism like? So there's not, as I said, like there's not like one box fits all approach, as it is such a massive spectrum. What we can definitely say is that a lot of people that have autism have a love for routine. So they love, for example, just having that daily routine. I know like a lot of people would say, oh, I have that as well, but with autism, it's much, much more intense. For example, there's a lot of research been done with children who have autism, and they find it, that's why, for example, the school time, like when children go to school or they start going to kindergarten, it gets really difficult for them because it's a constantly changing environment, and with changing classes, with changing class sizes, with changing classmates, changing teachers, and it's just really continuously breaking them out of routines. Again, strong sensitivity to noise, scent, and light, and all of these issues often relate to having issues maintaining a social life. Again, because a social life itself with friend structures, it's really, really difficult for people who are really prone to be extremely sensible to changes in their environment. And because our society is entirely built on change, I think nowadays we have an approach of change is good. It can often be difficult for people who seek substantially, who seek like safety, or like something that lasts for a longer period, who really struggle to deal with something that falls out of a routine. For example, a good example would be going to a party, as a simple example. So often people with autism, again, not everyone, just speaking like to give a couple of examples. So people with autism, for example, who go to a party, often thoughts that go to their mind is, okay, I'm getting a little bit anxious because I don't know who might be there. It's again that idea of falling out of a certain expectation. or a certain routine or something that I'm known to, and exposing myself, making myself vulnerable by not knowing what's going to happen. And of course, like when you go to a party, often the music is quite loud. There are quite a lot of people talking, which results in a lot of stimuli, which the brain has to process, which is just a lot, can be very exhausting. Um, then again, reading facial expressions, as I said earlier, is a difficulty, but that also often ties in with understanding jokes and sarcasm, which can often make people with autism feel a bit uncomfortable, because it can be difficult for people to understand. If you don't understand sarcasm, you take something extremely offensive, and that is a massive issue, because obviously the original meaning wasn't, to offend someone, but to crack a joke or something. And that is not always the best approach. Also, autism is characterized as a hidden disability. So what that means is basically that people with autism doesn't look necessarily any different from anyone else, which again makes it, from a social point of view, difficult for people, because there's still like according to a lot of social studies, there's still this issue that people still think that um, people who have some sort of, mental issues or disorders, you always see that, but that's for a lot of, especially things such depression or anxiety or autism, it's not the case. I think we need to get rid of this stigma that you always look a certain way if you have something. I think it's really important that we more listen to people when they tell you something, rather than look how they look. And so the question is, okay, what actually causes autism? So we know what can autism could be like, what the struggles are, but what causes autism? And it's quite an interesting discussion. So I watched a couple of TED Talks about this, and listened to a couple of podcasts. But the main thing that I found was that people, or scientists or researchers, they mainly argue that it's some sort of a combination of genetic and environmental factors, which could actively influence how our brain develops. However, it is definitely, that is completely ruled out yet. So it is not caused by a person's upbringing or social circumstances. I've read a couple of psychology articles from like 1920, 1930. It was interesting because they still like argued that it might be, the way you raise your children. Some people back then speculate that it was still like developed by children who were experienced to divorce because of childhood drama. But that's definitely not the case. So nowadays we still not 100% sure where it's coming from, but can definitely we can definitely say that it's not a reason of social circumstances, rather than a combination of genetic and environmental factors. And then, so I also tried to find out how people treat autism and how it's treated, because it is so different. And as I said, like, there are lots of people who have autism who barely have any restrictions, while there are other people who really struggle to do daily tasks. And so there came a huge list of therapies. I think the number one approach to autism currently that we have is physical and psychological therapy. CBT, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, is quite a common approach to treat it, and as well as speech therapy. So this again would, for example, speech therapy was often applied for people with Asperger's syndrome as well, where you develop certain types of patterns, speech patterns, where it's difficult for you to pronunciate or articulate yourself in a way that other people can easily understand it. And speech therapy basically helps with that. And obviously, like, a number of different types of approved medications. Um, and that brings me to the next point. So why is it important to design for people with autism? So just to give like a number here. So 1 in 100 people have autism alone in the UK. So that makes over 700,000 people here, and over 1% of the entire world population. That's quite a big number if you think about it. That's quite a lot of people to consider. Um, And also, just beside the fact, like the pure number fact, like a lot of research has shown, because people love, with autism, a lot of them love routines and really struggle with often with changing social environments. A lot of them feel very comfortable online, and use websites and internet and all digital experiences often to socialize, to shop, to learn, and therefore there's quite a high representation of people with autism online, which is often not, because it's difficult. Like you can't go on Google Analytics and check the exact number, but there's a lot of people and a lot of users that we probably also analyzed in a way where we just didn't know they had autism. And that brings me to how to design as non-autistic neurotypical designers for people with autism. So I thought about, based on the research that I found and the articles I wrote, I read, I thought about like different ways of, like, from a design perspective, maybe also from a development perspective, or how people, who work in technology, how we could approach this a little bit more to make just things a little bit more accessible, and just to help a little bit with, making more overall user-friendly experiences for everyone. So I structured this in different types that are quite important in terms of designing, that we always need to consider. So the first one being imagery. So there's a research study that I found really interesting. It was basically testing visual cues and reaction towards people with autism. And they found that people with autism, really, a lot of them are visual learners. So that means that basically they have an easier time understanding visual cues rather than any other sort of stimuli. And this was especially effective, for example, if the visual cue would some sort help to support text, or help with reading comprehensions, and would be used in a way that it could expand the text itself and could add an extra element of explanation. That also brings me to the other point, that text or images in combination with text, images should mainly only used if it actually adds another benefit. So it should not just be used for the visual representation itself, but really if it has some sort of additional positive effect on someone, or on the content of the page, and can really add another layer of information. That again ties into the next point, which was text. So in terms of text, here, based on the research, we found that text is best placed separately from the rest, and in a clear and clean structure, just simply because text can be quite daunting. I don't know if that's the right word, but daunting, or like difficult to comprehend for people with autism, especially if it's a lot of information, because it's just again, a lot of things often happen on a website. There's often not just text, and it just creates a lot of information that needs to be processed in the brain. And so by really making this text clear and having it clearly represented, and it just is an easier way of processing information rather than having text and images and all fused together. So that brings me to the layout structure. So I kind of had a quote that I found really interesting from this research study. So this was actually a research study conducted with people with ASD. So ASD stands for autism spectrum disorder. And it was basically a usability test that was conducted. I will just read this because I thought this was quite interesting. As a consequence, they may have an advantage in processing fast amount of complex static information. On the other hand, they may have issues processing rapidly changing information, such as people moving and talking on crowded streets. In this latter case, they perceive a chaotic rush of impressions, which can make them feel overwhelmed and powerless. So what this refers to is that a lot of research suggests that people with autism, what they found was that often people have a really amazing cognitive skill in terms of processing all the information, but rapidly changing information can be quite daunting and quite negatively experienced for people with autism. And so this is something that we should look out for. And this ties into rapidly changing layouts, anything that shows like some sort of like a layout structure change that is not necessarily or don't add any value to the overall content on the page. And this all relies on the fact of hypersensitivity, and that people, for example, are just much more sensitive to visual and auditory stimuli. And on that note, for example, what I found was that a lot of people, there was speculation, it wasn't official, but like that, for example, Steve Jobs could have had autism, that there was quite a lot of cues for it. And that's why he always wanted to have Apple, or every Apple product, to be designed very, very clean. That there's a reason behind this. And basically avoiding any unnecessary elements of movement and animation. And again, as I said, we need some sort of like a consistent and clear structure in a layout, and allow some sort of pattern to be recognized. So if we have like, that's what we basically doing, that's what we usually try to find always, is like, when we do like design systems or like a library, we try to develop patterns which can be drag and dropped and be easily applied, just so we allow like an overall cohesive experience, rather than having like every page of a website completely different, and that would make it really, really difficult for someone with autism. But even that now, like even when we do these patterns, or we use those design systems, it can still be really, really difficult depending on how colorful these things often are, how are they laid out. So what here goes here, basically, the simpler the better. And that brings me to color. So in terms of color, there was another research study that was also conducted with children, and they basically tested different types of children toys and objects in terms of color preference. And over 98% of children participants who had ASD would choose a toy that had some sort of a muted color, such as like brown or gray or beige. And while it was an A/B test technically, so there was an experiment where they had a control variable and a test variable, and the control variable would be children with neurotypical brains, and they would usually go for like the flashy colors. That's why often like in children's commercials you see a lot of colors that are used, like red, yellow, because a lot of like neurotypical children are very, very prone to these things. However, it's interesting because autistic children are often like the complete opposite on this, and they much more prefer muted colors, gray and beige. And that also ties in like this whole thing like that we see on websites a lot, when you have like a notification and it's always red and it's always like, alarming. I'm still like very keen to make these things like blue or green, or like a nice forest green, just keep it more muted, because I think we don't necessarily need this awareness, like, of this alarming color all the time. And I think it has almost developed like a dark pattern in a way, that is used so frequently, because you see red and you need like, oh, I need to check this, but actually that's not the case. And yeah, the scientific reason behind this is that just brighter colors, they just basically have a higher luminance value, which means that higher luminance means there are more particles in the color itself, which means that the brain needs to process more information. And again, for someone who is prone to be sensitive to visual stimuli, it just needs much more effort for the brain to get all this information right, and it just takes longer, and it's just much more exhausting. So that's why the researchers concluded that the reason why those children have chosen with ASD has chosen the muted colors is just because it's much easier for them to process this information, and more pleasant. Then we go into metaphors. So here we talk about central coherence. So the term that is used in central coherence is basically that people with autism have different cognitive abilities than people with neurotypical brains. And this can be so, as I said earlier, like they can be really proficient in understanding information as a whole, but often the issue lies in understanding inferred meaning. So that's why I said metaphors, because we often use, especially in content design, we often try to make things really, really exciting and really, really interesting from that perspective, and really try to find the right wording. But from like an accessibility point of view, I think often we forget that keeping things plain as possible is actually a really, really good approach. And it's not our fault. I think it's our society, and it's how like how a lot of things are these days. And they also like some sort of polarizing and, catch somebody's attention. But in terms of really making things accessible, technically we should stay with more simple, understandable languages, not just for people with autism, but for example, also with elderly people is another thing that's really important about this. And here I drew somebody with a golden heart, which just means like, oh, they have a heart of gold. For example, like where an autistic person would, for example, take this very literal if they would read that on a website. Oh, that person has a heart of gold. How is that possible? Not that they're stupid, but it's just literally like, it's an inferred meaning that just some people struggle with. And while we, like a neurotypical person, would probably understand, hey, they are a good person. That's what is meant by this. And again, it's not everyone with autism. It's just a different spectrum. So but a lot of people struggle with this who have ASD. Again, as I said, like plain language can be really supportive in that way. Using iconography, always in combination with labels, just makes things so much easier in terms of metaphors and text, and just making a more friendly website experience where possible. At least in the flow text. I mean, I know it's not always possible in terms of headlines, but I think in the flow text we should stick with really simple language. 6, navigation. So the next point was basically about navigation. So what we found, or what I concluded was, based on the entire research that I found, was that basically we should just keep it as simple as possible. So having one, reducing the amount to toolbars to one, having big descriptive labels for buttons in combination with icons. Again, this really helps autistic people, but also people, for example, with reading disabilities, with people who have visual impairments, and obviously like a progress bar. I mean, we say it's a good practice thing anyway, but just giving people the sense of structure that a lot of people with ASD like or need, really helps to just make that a little bit more easier for people. And the last point is interaction. So here the idea is that interactions, they should only be added if they add an additional benefits. So not basically purely used for the visual effect. So for example, horizontal scrolling was found, this was a research study that was done with people with ASD in terms of website experiences, and it found that, for example, horizontal scrolling can be extremely unpleasant for people with ASD, because it is a little bit uncomfortable sometimes for some people to not knowing what's hidden. And it's just like this again, not really knowing, inferred meaning. Okay, what is hidden there? It's just not a really clean layout experience where they can expect something to be laid out in a certain way, but it's hiding the content, which can just be a little bit distracting and uncomfortable for people to use. So for example, I quoted someone here who was a research participant in a usability study for people with Asperger syndrome, and he basically said websites can be so distracting. It takes me ages to do anything sometimes, as I feel like I have to read every word and click on every link. And this just again emphasizes on the fact that people with ASD often struggle to focus on these things and really just have a lot of information to process. And I think as the far we can keep it the most easy, or like the most simple, I think we make it not just more pleasant and easier to use. And additionally to that, so it is said that around 40% of people with ASD have also an anxiety disorder, and this can often reflect in, for example, something that we as neurotypical people find already, we don't find it great, we find it maybe annoying, and that can actually cause severe anxiety for people with ASD, because this goes, for example, for animated banners, autoplay, ads, or pop-ups, but it's not always the thing of like you're always, when you're using digital experiences or you're on a website, you're not always in your home where you can, just close the laptop. For example, this refers to ticket machines. For example, if you go to like a train station and you just want to, you have those big screens and you just want a ticket, and there's lots of pop-ups, like the way it's often like blurred in. I always complain about it, but it's just so like, it's not necessarily the best way it could be done. And this way, it just somebody with ASD can get stressed very easily about this, especially if you have you're just very sensitive to certain type of stimuli. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind whenever we think about these kinds of things. But for websites, I think there's a lot of things that we already don't like pop-ups. And I think so looking out for these things, I think will make the experience itself already better. So in terms of reading recommendations, if you are interested to find out more about autism in general, what I found was these two books. So I didn't read the entire books. I did read some extracts from them. So the first one is called Connecting with the Spectrum Autism. So it basically talks about how we as neurotypical people, it's more about neurotypical, how we can people understand just people with autism a little bit better, in terms of trying to walk in their shoes and just trying to make sense around the world and what patterns we should avoid or what we should not do. And the second one is called The Pattern Seeker. So this is basically the idea is here that often developing patterns is quite an interesting task, actually. So there's been a lot of research been done about people with ASD who develop certain patterns who are extremely thought out and thought through. And this is basically how we could use these really, really intelligent patterns often to apply them to something else. And it was quite an interesting approach because I haven't seen that anywhere else. So, and in terms of your support, what can you do to support autism in terms of, or besides just designing or being more accessible, making things better for people? There is the National Autistic Society, which is I think it is UK led. It's a massive organization, quite big. I think it's the biggest in the UK, and they invest lots of money in this topic. It's all about autism. It's all about research. It's all about providing healthcare specialists who can support other people with it, giving more information, and providing job opportunities for people with ASD, and just overall just informing also the public about it and just making it a more just like a more normal thing, and just making people aware of it. And they have a little bit of a donation. They have a donation button there, so you can sign up if you want for it monthly, or you can do a one-time donation. I did it just because I think the entire, if you do a little bit of research, they're doing great jobs. They have a massive amount of information on their website. So I think it's a good way. You can also choose how much you literally you could do £1 a month, but just don't feel pressured. But just so you know, there are definitely a lot of people out there who would appreciate it and who really actively work on this to drive towards a more inclusive society. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.